Imagine waking up to a headline that could shake every home, every car, and every power line in the country. On a sunny morning in Washington, President Donald Trump declares a 50% tariff on all copper imports. Just like that, the metal that quietly powers our lives, from the wiring in your smartphone to the motors in electric vehicles, becomes the center of a high-stakes trade battle. The numbers are staggering. Within less than 24 hours, the U.S. loses an estimated $4.2 billion, while copper prices on the COMEX exchange surge 13% overnight, hitting $5.95 per pound, a record high. This isn't just an abstract market shift. This is a shock wave set to ripple through every American household and industry that relies on this essential metal. Copper may be silent, but it's now making its voice heard, loud and clear. And the question everyone is asking, who pays the price for this sudden, sweeping decision? From your electric car to the lights in your home, the cost is coming, and it's coming fast. To understand why copper is suddenly in the spotlight, we need to look at the bigger picture of President Trump's trade strategy. This isn't his first tariff move. Over the past few years, the administration has imposed 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum, slapped duties on lumber, and even targeted cars. Copper is the latest escalation in a long-running strategy to protect American industries, but it comes with a familiar pattern: sudden, sweeping, and unpredictable. Trump himself put it plainly at a cabinet meeting. Other things, big ones. Now today we're doing copper. That casual phrasing hides the reality, a unilateral decision that can immediately disrupt global trade and domestic markets alike. Unlike policies that take months to implement, these tariffs hit hard and fast, leaving industries scrambling to adapt. This pattern reveals a core tension: protectionism versus practicality. On paper, tariffs are supposed to safeguard domestic producers. In reality, when applied without warning to essential materials like copper, they create chaos. And for the U.S., a country that relies heavily on imports for refined copper, the stakes are enormous. The moment the 50% copper tariff was announced, the first domino fell. Copper prices in the U.S. market jumped 13% overnight, with COMEX futures hitting a record $5.95 per pound and CME contracts climbing to around $5.64 to $5.69 per pound. This was more than just a spike, it was a market alarm, signaling that supply chains were about to feel the squeeze. Interestingly, while U.S. prices soared, the London Metal Exchange actually saw a slight dip. Why? Traders feared that the U.S. market, now artificially inflated by tariffs, would demand less copper, creating a gap between American and global prices. This price gap of up to 25% was unprecedented and opened the door for arbitrage. Traders looking to profit by buying copper cheaply abroad and selling it at the higher U.S. price. In simple terms, the tariff didn't just raise costs, it fractured the market, creating a scenario where U.S. companies suddenly face copper that was far more expensive than anywhere else in the world. And that's just the beginning. Because when supply costs spike, every industry that depends on copper is about to feel the shock. As soon as the 50% tariff was announced, Canada didn't hesitate. The nation that supplies over 40% of the U.S.'s refined copper immediately flexed its economic muscle. Canadian authorities froze all export contracts, and mining giants like Teck Resources and Hudbay Minerals halted shipments to the American market. This wasn't just a symbolic protest. It was a calculated high-stakes move to protect Canada's economic interests. Canada's leverage is enormous. With $9.3 billion worth of annual copper exports, much of it historically destined for the U.S., Ottawa held a powerful tool in its hands. Canadian officials made it clear: we can no longer rely on a trade partner that is unstable and unilaterally changes the rules of the game. In other words, the U.S.'s aggressive tariff didn't just threaten market prices, it threatened trust and long-standing trade relationships. This moment marks a turning point. Canada didn't react emotionally or defensively, it acted strategically. By redirecting exports, freezing shipments, and signaling to global markets that the U.S. could no longer be counted on, Canada became the first real mover in this emerging trade war. What started as a U.S. tariff had now evolved into an international chess game, and the next few moves would determine which country controls the global copper supply. The ripple effects of the copper tariff hit U.S. industries almost immediately. Copper isn't just a commodity. It's the backbone of modern manufacturing. From the wiring in electric vehicles to telecommunication networks, home electrical systems, and industrial motors, nearly every sector depends on it. When the price surged, companies across the board felt the pressure. For example, electric vehicle manufacturers suddenly faced higher costs for each car's wiring and motors. Utility companies struggled with rising prices for transformers and conductors, and construction firms saw the cost of wiring and insulation climb dramatically. Even industries that thought they were insulated, like electronics assembly, couldn't escape the impact. Some businesses were able to rely temporarily on legacy copper stockpiles, but these reserves only delay the inevitable. As these supplies run out, the effects become unavoidable: production delays, higher costs, and potential layoffs. The tariff, initially aimed at protecting domestic industry, has instead triggered a supply chain crisis that stretches across every corner of American manufacturing, a shockwave that threatens to push industries toward stagnation. To justify the copper tariff, President Trump activated Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, declaring copper a strategic metal critical to national security. In theory, Section 232 allows the president to impose tariffs or quotas if imports threaten the security of the United States. On paper, it's a powerful tool meant for rare and essential resources. But here's the catch: copper is already a global commodity with complex supply chains. Labeling it strategic doesn't suddenly create more domestic production. The U.S. produces only about 50% of its refined copper needs, with a limited refining capacity. Major facilities like ASARCO in Arizona are already running at full capacity, or even shutting down occasionally, meaning that domestic production cannot replace imports quickly enough. Economists and trade experts warn that this type of protectionism often backfires. While the tariff is intended to protect American manufacturers, it instead raises costs, reduces availability, and introduces volatility into every sector that relies on copper. By framing copper as essential for national security, the administration justified an aggressive policy. But the immediate reality is that the tariff creates more economic risk than security. It's a textbook example of a well-intentioned legal tool colliding with real-world supply chain constraints, setting the stage for cascading disruptions in industries from EVs to energy infrastructure. Once the 50% tariff hit, the US copper market didn't just spike, it fractured. Copper in America suddenly cost up to 25% more than on global exchanges like the London Metal Exchange. This created a rare phenomenon, an arbitrage opportunity, where traders could buy copper cheaply abroad and sell it at a much higher price in the US. At first glance, this might sound like a win for traders, but for American manufacturers, it's a disaster. Every product that depends on copper, from EV motors to power lines, is now more expensive to produce. The gap between US and global prices exposes a fundamental flaw in protectionist logic. Tariffs don't create more copper, they just make it costlier for domestic businesses. Think of it like this. Imagine a grocery store suddenly raising the price of flour by 50% while global prices stay normal. Bakeries can't magically produce more bread at the old cost. Instead, they either raise prices, cut production, or go out of business. That's exactly what's happening across U.S. industries dependent on copper. The market dynamics triggered by this tariff aren't theoretical, they're real, immediate, and costly. Canada didn't just stop at freezing shipments. In a calculated long-term move, the country began redirecting its copper exports to Asia, including Japan, South Korea, and China. This wasn't just a reaction, it was a strategic pivot designed to reduce dependence on the U.S. and secure new, more stable markets. To support this, the Canadian government unveiled a CAD $1.8 billion investment plan aimed at expanding copper export capacity and building infrastructure for these new trade routes. Major mining companies, including giants like Glencore, Teck Resources, and Hudbay Minerals, quickly adjusted, sending raw copper to Asian refineries instead of the U.S. The implications are profound. The U.S., which historically dominated the North American copper supply chain, is now being sidelined. By moving exports to Asia, Canada isn't just protecting its economy, it's becoming a strategic competitor in the global copper market. What started as a U.S. tariff has inadvertently created a power shift, with Canada emerging as a key player shaping the future of copper distribution worldwide. The US's ability to weather this copper shock is limited by one hard fact: it can't produce enough refined copper domestically. In 2024, the country produced just over half of its copper needs, relying heavily on imports from Canada, Chile, Peru, and Mexico to fill the gap. While raw copper exists within the US, refining capacity is extremely constrained, with major facilities like ASARCO in Arizona already running near maximum output, or even shutting down at times due to logistical or financial issues. This bottleneck means that no sudden policy change, including tariffs, can instantly replace the supply that previously came from abroad. This limitation isn't just a number on a spreadsheet. It has tangible consequences for industries. Electric vehicle manufacturers, utility companies, and construction firms all rely on a steady, affordable supply of refined copper. When imports are blocked or diverted, domestic plants can't scale fast enough to meet demand. The result is higher costs, production delays, and potential project cancellations, leaving American businesses exposed and consumers facing price increases in everyday products. The domestic production gap also highlights a deeper tension between protectionist policy and industrial reality. Tariffs are intended to safeguard domestic producers, but when the infrastructure isn't in place to absorb the shock, they instead create scarcity and volatility. The US may hope for self-reliance, but in the case of copper, that goal is decades away. For now, industries are caught in a squeeze, with limited options to secure the raw materials they need to operate, leaving the economy vulnerable to both short-term disruption and longer-term inflationary pressure. The copper tariff isn't just an abstract policy, it's hitting real businesses and consumers across the US. Take electric vehicles, for example. Each car uses roughly 80 kilograms of copper for wiring, motors, and circuit boards. With copper prices surging, analysts estimate that production costs for a single EV rise by about $90 on average, and in some cases, the increase can climb into the thousands of dollars per vehicle. Companies like Tesla and Ford are reportedly losing millions monthly, and several EV projects have already been delayed due to shortages of this critical material. Utilities are feeling the pinch as well. Copper-based conductors, transformers, and grid components have jumped 22 to 25% in price, forcing some energy providers to request emergency rate hikes. This is a direct pass-through cost to consumers, meaning higher electricity bills for households across the country. Construction and home building sectors are also under pressure. Rising costs for wiring, insulation, and other copper-dependent materials could increase the cost of building a single home by $17,000 to $22,000, creating headaches for developers and buyers alike. Even smaller manufacturers aren't immune. Companies in states like Ohio and Indiana, producing electrical wiring and electronics, are losing contracts to overseas suppliers in Vietnam and Thailand, where copper prices remain stable. The combined effect is clear. The tariff has created a cascade of disruptions across multiple industries, highlighting just how deeply intertwined copper is with daily life, and why a single policy decision can have far-reaching consequences for both businesses and ordinary Americans. The 50% copper tariff is more than an industry headache. It's a potential macroeconomic warning sign. Financial experts, including UBS, project that the US could see a 0.5% drop in GDP in a single quarter if disruptions continue. Industries that depend on copper, from automotive to energy to construction, risk slowing production, delaying projects, and even laying off workers. The ripple effect could drag the broader economy into stagnation. Historically, this situation has a cautionary parallel. In the 1930s, the Hoover-era protectionist policies, like the Smoot-Hawley tariff, contributed to a global trade freeze and deepened the Great Depression. While today's context is different, the principle is the same. Aggressive tariffs on essential commodities can backfire, isolating the country economically and creating inflationary pressure. Even beyond GDP, the effects are felt in daily commerce. Rising copper costs inflate prices across energy, construction, telecommunications, and transportation, squeezing margins for companies and budgets for consumers. Analysts warn that if stockpiles of copper run out, these costs won't just be theoretical. They will directly hit American wallets, making the tariff not just a trade policy, but a nationwide economic shock. The impact of the copper tariff doesn't stop at boardrooms or trading floors. It hits ordinary Americans in their daily lives. Every light bulb, every home wiring system, and every electric vehicle now carries the hidden cost of higher copper prices. For instance, an EV that previously cost $40,000 might see a $3,000 to $6,000 increase due to copper price surges. Similarly, building a new home could cost an extra $17,000 to $22,000, directly affecting families trying to buy or renovate homes. The ripple effect is everywhere, quietly raising the cost of living for millions. Utilities and energy providers are also passing the cost along to consumers. With copper-based transformers and conductors climbing 22 to 25% in price, electricity companies are filing for emergency rate hikes. This isn't just an inconvenience, it's money out of Americans' pockets for something as essential as powering their homes. Even smaller everyday items, like electronics, wiring for appliances, or charging ports for devices, are affected, meaning the tariff's reach extends into nearly every corner of modern life. Beyond prices, the tariff creates uncertainty and stress. Families and small businesses can no longer plan easily because the cost of materials is unpredictable. Delays in construction, postponed EV deliveries, and rising utility bills all add up, creating a tangible sense that economic decisions made in Washington are directly influencing daily life at home. The human cost of this policy is real, measurable, and growing, highlighting that trade decisions aren't abstract. They hit wallets, jobs, and lifestyles in very concrete ways. The 50% copper tariff has revealed a stark reality. The U.S. is no longer in full control of the global copper supply chain. By imposing this tariff, the administration hoped to protect domestic industry, but instead, it pushed Canada to pivot strategically, redirecting exports to Asia and investing billions in infrastructure to bypass the U.S. American industries are scrambling, consumers are paying more, and the nation's influence over a critical resource is slipping. This isn't just about copper, it's about shifting global economic power. Canada has transformed from a dependent supplier into a strategic competitor, while the U.S., lacking sufficient refining capacity, faces rising costs, industrial slowdowns, and a risk of economic isolation. The ripple effects touch every electric vehicle, every power line, every home, and every piece of technology that relies on copper. Protectionism, in this case, has exposed the vulnerabilities of trying to control a global supply chain unilaterally. So here's the question for viewers. Is this a bold step towards self-reliance, or a self-inflicted wound on the U.S. economy? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and share how you see this unfolding. And if you want to stay ahead of the latest global trade shifts, don't forget to subscribe to Deep State and turn on notifications. Because in a world where copper can reshape economies overnight, staying informed isn't optional, it's essential.